Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Gutstein, and I'm the founder of Relationship Development Intervention, RDI. And I'm really excited to be able to share the latest developments in RDI with you in this videotape. You know, when I set out to develop a new remediation program for autism and autism spectrum disorders, I was beset by questions and doubts that I had never encountered in all of my other work as a clinical researcher, program developer, a therapist, and a teacher. The first and most fundamental question was whether remediation was even possible for people on the autism spectrum. Should we even have a goal to alter the way that people's brains functioned? When I began traveling and talking to experts, I typically heard some degree of skepticism. Some of them said maybe the best we can accomplish is to teach superficial emulations of abilities that we typical people use to make friendships or solve problems in a changing world. Maybe instead we should settle for creating teaching styles and environmental modifications that would allow people on the autism spectrum to marginally function, albeit in very artificial settings and with dependence on other people. Maybe we should just make everything black and white for them, or make the environment totally predictable, or teach them in a rote, scripted manner. Even though we knew that if we did that, we were diminishing dramatically their chances to have a quality of life. In talking to other groups, what I heard was remediation might be a waste of time since we were so close to a cure. I heard about fantastic developments in genetics, nutrition, medication, and many other treatments. Yet when I talked to scientists, it was clear that we were decades, if not generations, away from any type of curative treatment. Or maybe we already had intervention programs that were helping people to recover from autism and function normally. Maybe some said I was trying to reinvent the wheel. Well, I went in search of these programs. I started to look at research, and I couldn't find a single study that showed me what happened to treated children when they became teenagers, let alone adults. Not a single study that showed any treatment that helped a child to have a friend or collaborate in a work group or hold a real curious conversation or solve problems in a flexible way. But that really was no surprise, as I couldn't find any programs that were focusing on remediating the autism itself. So I decided to take the simplest approach, to assume that remediation was possible. I knew well that cognitive interventions have been successful in changing brain pathways of people with other disorders like dyslexia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and depression. I knew we could restore functioning to stroke victims, and there was no research that indicated that the brains of people with autism were less able to be changed than those of these other groups. I'm fortunate to begin my work at a time when researchers have identified many of the core areas of deficit that are unique to people in the autism spectrum and that present obstacles to them having a quality of life. These many researchers around the world have provided the initial clues that have helped me to begin constructing this arduous roadmap that is clearly still a work in process. Now, the great news is that we have found that people on the spectrum can learn to think and perceive in new and more complex, subtle ways. We really believe we are changing the way their brains are functioning. They can learn to enjoy and value change and surprise and not perceive the world in black and white, but rather in shades of gray. Now, another question was raised, which surprised me. And the question was whether it was right to change people with autism or to try to change people with autism. I heard some say that people with autism should be treated as if they were a different species, and that autism shouldn't be considered a disorder, just a difference. Well, I'll tell you, this didn't make sense to me. Because to me, there's a difference between trying to alter someone's personality, who they really are, and providing them with greater options and choices in life. It would be like saying that someone with a seizure disorder is happy having seizures. Not a very logical conclusion. Well, to understand this more, I talked at length with many adults on the spectrum, often the most successful people as defined by society. Well, they told me that they were not alien beings. They were the flesh and blood children of their parents. And they desired the same things as anyone else would. But typically they just felt discouraged and hopeless of attaining many of the things we take for granted: a true friendship, a comfortable work environment, and marriage. They asked me to share with you that they are not aliens, just human beings who have gone through life in a state of perpetual confusion, constantly feeling overwhelmed, like they're about to, at any moment, step into a chasm and get swallowed up, with no way to anticipate when and where that will happen. Now, later on, we're going to discuss how people on the spectrum avoid dynamic systems. And those are social encounters where change and uncertainty are valued. And rather, they attempt, unsuccessfully, to live their lives in static systems where things never change. You know, when we consider how even regular day-to-day situations create so much noise and confusion for people on the autism spectrum, are we really surprised that someone would choose to avoid increasing the degree of uncertainty in their world, even if it meant giving up the richest experiences that we live for? Well, the next question I encountered was whether, if we missed some early window of opportunity, you know, I kept hearing about the age of 5 as the last chance, that the brain would have solidified and we would have had no chance to influence its development. Well, I began to think of this as the hard-boiled egg theory of the brain, as if the brain started out as a raw egg, became soft-boiled, but if left in the pan for too long would harden and become unchangeable. Well, you know, this doesn't fit with modern neurological science. Researchers have demonstrated that people's brains change throughout their lives. The brain is a dynamic organism that's always altering its pathways and connections to become more efficient or solve new problems. Even if we consider that some brain pathways become more solidified, the research demonstrates that the critical brain pathways impaired in people with autism don't fully develop until at least early adulthood. You know, I believe that there is a plan for children's development in making them into competent adults. Now, I didn't invent this plan, nor did developmental psychologists. We're only privileged to have the opportunity to observe and catch glimpses of the beauty of God's plan. You know, I couldn't begin by assuming that children on the autism spectrum were excluded from this plan. Rather, I began with the assumption that they were here on Earth to present a challenge and opportunity for all of us. The challenge was to not take the plan for granted, to make the effort to understand and appreciate the thousands of elegant small steps it takes to turn a small infant into a fully competent human being. The opportunity was the permission we're given when we guide someone with autism to slow down and admire the daily miracles of development. Now, what we've found is that if we carefully observe and chronicle this plan of development, if we take the time to truly appreciate the complexity of the thousands of intricate steps that have to be taken in order that people on the autism spectrum can develop in exactly the same manner as anyone else, well, maybe slower and more sequentially, but in the same progression and same results, we found there's no need to change the plan that has and it's a plan that has unfolded in the same manner in every culture for thousands of years. The first question I start out with as a program developer and as a researcher is, what is the current state of affairs in this field? What is happening to adults in the autism spectrum? How successful have we been? And we can't be afraid to look at that information. Whether it's dismal, whether it's good, it really doesn't matter. It gives us a baseline. How well are we doing? It doesn't tell us we can't do better. It just gives us a starting point. Well, when I began to look at research, I found two things that were critically important. One was that there was very little interest in looking at adults on the autism spectrum. Interestingly enough, almost all of the work was going into working with very young children.